What exactly makes you think she bought that ticket? The question wasn't asked in confusion, it was steeped in suspicion. Loud enough to carry across gate 34C, it sliced through the airport chatter and turned a few heads toward the slim black teenager standing alone at the front of the first-class line. 17-year-old Jada Cross didn't shift. She stood still, chin lifted, posture straight, clutching her first-class boarding pass in one hand and her small leather backpack strap in the other. Her expression, calm, measured, unreadable, did not waver. The woman blocking her way, a white flight attendant with perfectly clipped blonde hair and a practiced smile, stared down at her with tightly folded arms, suspicion etched into every muscle of her face. Tell us, where are you from? Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? If you believe discrimination has no place in the world, hit that subscribe button and share this story. Jada had flown before many times, in fact. Her father had made sure she could navigate TSA and board a plane solo with the confidence of a corporate executive. She knew which gate agents smiled with sincerity and which scanned her like a barcode out of place. Her father always said, "Travel like you own the plane, not like you're trying to prove you belong on it." But today, even that mindset wasn't enough. Jada wore a pressed charcoal blazer, navy trousers, and sleek sneakers. Her hair was styled into a soft side bun, and her face was free of makeup, save for clear gloss and a swipe of mascara. She looked like what she was, composed, prepared, and destined for something greater. But somehow, none of that mattered in this moment. Not to the woman with the laminated name tag. Not to the murmuring crowd that was slowly gathering behind the velvet ropes. Not to the man who was already whispering to his wife, "I bet that ticket's fake." The flight attendant, Tracy, as her tag read, didn't ask for Jada's story. She didn't wonder where she was going or who she might be. She simply decided, based on the way Jada looked, that something wasn't adding up. Jada extended her boarding pass wordlessly. Tracy took it, held it under the scanner, then glanced at her as though she'd caught her with a stolen credit card. She scanned it again, then a third time. "It's not scanning properly," she said, not to Jada, but to the gate agent nearby. The problem wasn't the scanner. The problem, in Tracy's eyes, was the girl holding the ticket. Passengers began to slow behind her, curiosity stirring. Someone started filming with their phone, not openly but subtly from the hip. Another traveler sighed audibly. A middle-aged woman whispered to her seatmate, "She probably got upgraded by mistake." Jada didn't move. She handed over her ID and said nothing. Her voice was quiet, her gaze steady, her breathing controlled. She had been raised to understand moments like these weren't new. They were just visible now, live-streamed, uploaded, dissected. About 10 feet away, a young woman in leggings and a hoodie had already turned her Instagram live on. The caption read, "First-class drama. Black girl being held up again. Watch this." The screen ticked upward. 123 viewers. Then 267. Then 500. Still Jada waited. Tracy began asking questions. "Did you buy this ticket yourself? Where are your parents? Do you have any other ID?" The tone was polite only on the surface. The implication was anything but. Jada answered each question slowly, like reciting facts from a textbook. No irritation, no fear, just facts. She handed over a second form of ID. Tracy barely looked at it. Instead, she radioed for security. Gate 34C. Possible fraudulent first-class entry. Minor passenger. The words hit hard. Not because they were loud, but because they were loaded. Jada wasn't a threat. She was 17, traveling for a scholarship interview in Washington, D.C. The ticket had been purchased by her family's executive assistant days ago. The itinerary was booked through a corporate loyalty program. The seat 1A had been hers since last week. But none of that stopped the narrative that was being written in real time. Two uniformed security officers approached. One flanked her right. The other stayed near Tracy. They didn't touch her. Not yet. But their presence was enough to signal something had gone wrong. Jada was no longer a student traveler. She had become a situation. The live stream crossed 2,000 viewers. And Jada still hadn't called her father. He had called twice. She had ignored both. Not because she was afraid she wasn't, but because she was curious. Curious to see how far this would go if she didn't interrupt it with a last name. If she didn't say who her father was. If she didn't pull out the other phone, the one with the encrypted app and the executive-level contacts. So she waited, calm, silent, watching. The supervisor arrived next, whispering to Tracy. Both of them avoided eye contact with Jada now. The woman with the Instagram stream zoomed in slightly, catching every hushed word, every suspicious glance. Tracy now asked for confirmation of purchase. We've had issues with unverified tickets. Her words were vague, but her meaning was clear. Jada opened her phone and showed the receipt. She tapped into her airline loyalty app, Diamond status, over 500,000 miles logged under her profile. Still, the response was, "We just need to confirm with management." A businessman in the crowd scoffed. "She's wasting everyone's time." Another said, "This is ridiculous. If she doesn't belong here, just move her." Jada checked her watch. 9 minutes since she joined the line. 9 minutes of doubt, scanning, whispering, radio calls, and scrutiny. 9 minutes of being treated as if she were an imposter, simply for holding a premium boarding pass with the wrong color skin behind it. But she wasn't going to break. She had been trained for moments exactly like this. And the countdown was almost over. She reached into her blazer and tapped on the second phone. One message. One screen. One quiet instruction. Protocol 7. Gate 34C. Confirm authority. Hold the flight. And without saying a word, she watched the gate monitors begin to flicker. Because sometimes the strongest response is no response at all, until it's too late for the world to undo the damage it just live-streamed. At gate 34C, time slowed, but the tension rose fast. What started as one gate agent's suspicion had now grown into a scene. The people walking by slowed their steps. Some stopped altogether. Jada stood still as more eyes began to focus on her. But the pressure was no longer just on her. It had started to crack open something wider. Something that couldn't be stopped with a quiet apology. Tracy, the flight attendant who first blocked Jada, had stepped back to whisper with her supervisor. But there was no whispering quiet enough anymore. People had started recording. Phones were everywhere. One teenager sitting a few seats away had switched from Instagram Live to TikTok. The caption on her screen read, "Black teens stopped at first-class boarding. Watch this mess unfold." In less than 4 minutes, the viewer count had passed 3,000. Jada noticed the cameras but didn't react. She didn't raise her voice, didn't look for help, didn't even blink for longer than a second. She just stood. Her calmness only made Tracy look more unsure of herself. And it was that uncertainty, the fear of being wrong, that made her escalate the situation instead of backing down. The gate supervisor, a man named Darren, walked over and asked to scan Jada's ticket himself. It scanned perfectly. Green light, seat 1A. But that wasn't enough. He frowned, nodded slowly, and asked her to step aside so they could sort everything out. She obeyed without protest, taking only a small step back, but the crowd noticed. The message was clear. She was a problem. Jada's boarding pass had her name. Her ID matched. The credit card on file was connected to a corporate account. Still, the staff whispered. Still, the whispers turned into actions. They asked more questions. Not the kind of questions they would ask anyone else. Not, "Is this your seat?" But, "Who booked this for you?" Not, "Do you need help?" But, "Are your parents nearby?" These were questions made to shrink her, to make her feel small, to make her prove herself again and again, even though the system had already verified her. Other passengers began to notice the pattern. A few looked uneasy. A woman seated near the window kept glancing back and forth, phone in hand, pretending to check messages but clearly watching. A young man in a suit gave Jada a slight nod, but said nothing. And that was the problem. No one said anything. Not yet. Jada checked her watch. It had been 14 minutes. Her suitcase sat beside her, a discreet diamond status luggage tag hanging from the handle. Still, no one believed her. Still, she was being treated like a suspect. The scanners worked. Her documents were fine, but their eyes kept searching for a flaw. Something, anything they could use to justify their doubts. The cameras kept rolling. The crowd thickened. Tracy's voice grew sharper, but also thinner, like even she knew the situation had gotten away from her. Darren began tapping nervously on his tablet, searching through booking records, looking for red flags that weren't there. Jada didn't need to speak. The silence she held was louder than all the noise around her. Still, she could feel it, the subtle tightening in her chest, the kind that comes not from fear, but from holding your dignity too tightly for too long. Her fingers gripped the strap of her backpack a little harder. Her jaw tensed, though her expression stayed smooth. A child nearby asked her mother, "Why are they yelling at that girl?" The mother hushed her gently, pulling her closer, avoiding Jada's eyes. Another woman stood up, crossed her arms, and walked over to the gate to ask if the flight was still on time. Her tone was polite, but the message was clear. "Wrap this up. Move this along. This girl is making us late." But it wasn't Jada who was delaying the flight. It was the people who couldn't believe she belonged. The airport speakers crackled with boarding updates for other gates. But at 34C, the screen still read, "Final preparation." The delay hadn't been officially announced, but people knew. The clock was ticking, and the story was growing. Jada's second phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't ignore it. She glanced at the screen. A single message from her father's chief of staff. "Ready when you are." No emojis. No confusion. Just readiness. She didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, she looked out at the crowd. They were all part of the test now, and they didn't even know it. A new staff member appeared. A young woman with a kind face and nervous hands. She approached the gate agent and whispered something. Tracy stiffened, then waved her away. Jada caught every movement. She had learned to observe quietly. It was something her father taught her, not to win arguments, but to gather truth. Her training had never been about proving anyone wrong. It was about knowing when people would prove themselves without help, and they were doing exactly that. The live streams ticked past 15,000 viewers. Hashtags were already beginning to form. Hashtag Jada at gate 34. Hashtag let her board. Hashtag racial profiling in first class. Comments streamed in from people watching across the country. "She's more composed than I would be. This is disgusting. Name the airline." But still no apology. Still, no one in uniform said the words that should have come from the beginning. "You're right. We were wrong." Jada checked the time again. 20 minutes. Then came the final step. Tracy turned to the supervisor and said something too low to hear. He nodded. She picked up the radio and called security. Again. Not for protection. Not for help. But to make a point. Security wasn't there to ask questions. They were there to move people. Jada saw the officers approaching. 2 men in Navy uniforms. Calm faces, practiced hands. She didn't step away. She didn't panic. She simply shifted her weight, centered herself, and waited. Because she already knew what they didn't. This wasn't about a flight anymore. This was about who they thought she was. And in less than 5 minutes, they were all going to find out just how wrong they had been. By now, Gate 34C had stopped feeling like an airport terminal and started to feel more like a stage. Jada stood in the center of it, calm and composed, but surrounded by a quiet storm of whispers, stares, and eyes behind cameras. The security guards were just a few steps away. Their presence wasn't loud, but it changed the air. The space around Jada shifted, not because she had done anything wrong, but because the people who judged her thought she had. And now, others were beginning to notice something wasn't right. Passengers waiting to board were no longer simply watching. They were reacting. Some leaned in closer, pretending to stretch or check the time, their phones still recording. Others began whispering to each other more openly, no longer hiding their discomfort or curiosity. The tension wasn't just between Jada and the airline staff now. It had spread. The crowd was part of the story. In the front row of seats near the gate, a woman in a pink coat began typing on her phone. She wasn't filming, but she was tweeting. A single sentence. This black teen is being pulled aside in first class while clearly holding a valid ticket. Something's off. Her post gained traction almost instantly. 2 rows back, a young couple in matching travel hoodies looked back and forth between Jada and the airline workers. They didn't speak, but their expressions changed from curious to uncomfortable. The boy began filming quietly from under his backpack. A businessman pacing near the windows paused mid-call, raised an eyebrow and began watching. He didn't seem surprised, just disappointed, like he had seen this kind of situation before, like he had been waiting for someone to say something. But no one really had, yet. Jada still hadn't moved. Her face was calm, but inside, she could feel the weight building. Not just from the staff still doubting her, but from the silence of the people around her. The ones who could have said something but didn't. The ones who filmed but didn't speak. The ones who saw but weren't sure if it was their place to get involved. This silence was louder than anything else. And it was familiar. It reminded Jada of the first time she was followed around in a store. Of the time a teacher assumed she cheated because she scored too high. Of the moment she realized that no matter how neatly she dressed or how well she spoke, people would still see her as a question mark. But this time she wasn't alone. Because now the internet was watching. Her story had already left the terminal. On a nearby bench, a college student wearing earbuds tapped her screen with urgency. She was reading comments under a live stream, responding to strangers asking for updates. One comment read, "We need names. Airline? Flight number." Another, "This is going viral." Someone tagged the media. Jada didn't know any of this in full, but she could feel the shift. Something had turned. She looked at one of the guards. His face was blank, but his eyes looked unsure. Maybe he had daughters. Maybe he had a sense that this wasn't going to end well. Not for the airline. Not for the staff. Because now the crowd was moving. Slowly, cautiously, but visibly. A man in a gray suit stepped out of line and said something to a gate agent. His words couldn't be heard, but his face showed concern. The gate agent brushed him off. Another woman, older, wearing a church hat and carrying a Bible in her handbag, stood beside Jada quietly, not saying anything, but being present. That was the first real sign of support Jada had felt all morning. Not from someone who was paid to be there, but from someone who chose to be there. The woman didn't speak. She just gave Jada a look, one filled with kindness, dignity, and a quiet understanding that needed no words. And that look gave Jada strength. Not because she was weak, but because even the strongest people need to know someone is standing with them. Nearby, the woman who had been filming from the beginning finally stood up. She was now narrating her live stream. Her voice was soft but steady. "I've been sitting here for 25 minutes. This girl has done nothing but stand quietly while being treated like she's lying. Her ticket scanned. Her ID matched. But they still won't let her board." The live stream shot past 20,000 viewers. And now the whispering had become a hum. The tension was spreading fast. Not anger, but a different kind of energy. One that said, "This isn't going to go away quietly." Jada checked the clock. 31 minutes. Still not boarding. Still surrounded. Still waiting for someone to do the right thing. Behind the counter, the supervisor was growing visibly nervous. He tapped on the computer. He talked into his headset. He scribbled something on paper, only to scratch it out seconds later. He kept glancing at the growing crowd, at the security officers, at Tracy, who was now red-faced and visibly stressed. They didn't have control anymore. And they knew it. The passengers knew it too. Because suddenly, a man near the back of the crowd stepped forward. He raised his phone high and shouted to his stream, "This is Gate 34C, Flight 227 to Washington, D.C. This girl has every right to board this plane. She's being held back for no reason. We see you, and we're recording everything." That was the moment the mood fully shifted. A ripple went through the crowd. First confusion, then courage. Other people began stepping forward. Not shouting, just standing near. One woman asked if Jada needed water. Another man asked to speak with someone in charge. And for the first time, Jada felt the pressure lift slightly off her shoulders. Not because the airline had done the right thing, but because strangers finally had. Not because the staff changed their tone, but because the crowd found theirs. The guards still stood close. The gate agents still whispered. But the quiet was over. The crowd had joined the story. And no one, not even the airline, could stop what was coming next. It started with a vibration, barely noticeable, a gentle buzz in Jada's blazer pocket. Not the usual phone. The second one. The quiet one. The one that wasn't for friends or school or social apps. This one was for something else, something bigger. She didn't reach for it yet. She didn't need to. The signal told her everything she needed to know. Her silent message had been received. From the outside, nothing seemed to change. The staff kept moving. The security officers still lingered nearby. But behind the scenes, the air shifted. Something invisible but strong had entered the space. Jada looked out across the terminal. She could still feel the weight of the eyes watching her. Some were full of sympathy, others curiosity, a few disbelief. But it didn't matter anymore. Not really, because now something larger than opinion was in motion. She took a single step forward, calm, composed. Her fingers brushed the edge of her ID badge, still tucked inside her jacket. Not the state-issued one, not the school one. The other one, plastic, clipped, and rarely used. It wasn't meant to be shown often. That was part of its power. It was used only when absolutely necessary. And this moment had earned it. Behind her, the murmurs continued. The live streams kept climbing. Phones caught her every movement. To most people watching, Jada still looked like a lone girl in a sea of control she couldn't stop. But that wasn't true. Because Jada hadn't come to that gate to plead for fairness. She came to test it. That flight? It wasn't just transportation. It was a setup, an assessment, not of her, but of them. The airline, the staff, the system. Her father had created the protocol years ago. A way to observe customer experience from the inside, without cameras, without warning, without press releases. It was their family's way of holding the travel world accountable, of shining light without asking permission. Jada had trained for it since she was 13, not through lessons but through life. Her father, Christopher Cross, didn't raise his daughter to argue with gate agents or shout about bias. He raised her to watch, to listen, to let others reveal themselves fully, and when they did, to respond without rage, but with undeniable truth. And now truth was arriving. The monitors above the boarding gate began to flicker. The final preparation message blinked, then froze. Gate 34C paused. No announcement followed. No boarding call came. Just a strange, static stillness. Tracy, the flight attendant, turned to the supervisor with a frown. He began tapping nervously on his tablet. His fingers moved faster, scrolling through screens that didn't match what he expected. One more buzz. Jada reached inside her blazer this time. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled out the ID badge, the one with a silver outline and a blue stripe down the side. It read, Executive Youth Observer Cross Global Holdings. Access Level Tier 1. Clearance. Verified. It was small, simple, but to the right eyes it carried more weight than any boarding pass ever could. She didn't flash it. She didn't wave it in anyone's face. She clipped it calmly to her blazer's lapel and stood still. It took less than 30 seconds for someone to notice. A man in a black suit emerged from a nearby gate. Not security. Not staff. His earpiece gave him away. He wasn't here for routine. He moved with purpose, eyes scanning the area until they landed on Jada. His pace slowed slightly. Then he walked directly toward her, stopping just a few feet away. No words were exchanged. Just a nod. A silent sign, we're here. Moments later, the monitors changed again. This time, the words, Gate Hold, Executive Priority, appeared on the screen. The crowd shifted again. This wasn't normal. Something was happening. Passengers began looking around. Even those who had ignored the earlier tension now leaned forward, curious. What was going on? Why was the flight delayed? Why had someone in a suit approached the teen girl the staff had tried to remove? Tracy, watching it all, suddenly looked pale. The supervisor's radio crackled. He answered it quickly, but his face fell within seconds. He started pacing in a small circle, glancing at Jada, then at the man in the suit, then back to the flickering screens. Another message flashed across the tablet in his hand. His lips moved as he read it quietly to himself. Then, with a shaking breath, he lowered the tablet and turned toward Tracy. She stepped back instinctively, confusion growing in her eyes. She knew something had changed, but she didn't yet understand just how far the shift had gone. Jada stood steady. She hadn't spoken in nearly 20 minutes. And yet, without a single raised voice, she now had the attention of an entire terminal. The cameras were still rolling. More than 60,000 people were watching across multiple live streams. Comments flowed faster than anyone could read. Who is she? This just went next level. The power shift is real. She didn't even need to say anything. Jada's fingers brushed the edge of her ID again. Not to show it, just to remind herself it was real. She wasn't here by accident. She hadn't gotten lucky. This wasn't a twist of fate. It was the result of a plan. A family legacy built on quiet strength, steady observation, and justice that didn't beg for attention. It demanded accountability. She looked around once more. The same passengers who had doubted her now watched her with awe. The same crowd that stayed silent now stood still. And the same staff who had judged her were now shrinking back into uncertainty. All of this, without her ever needing to raise her voice. Because sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that waits. And as the monitors continued to blink, and the hold remained in place, the people around Gate 34C realized something had shifted. The girl they had dismissed wasn't just another passenger. She was the person holding the lever that could ground them all. The airport terminal had grown unusually quiet. The normal airport noise, rolling bags, loudspeaker calls, hurried footsteps, was still there in the background. But around Gate 34C, the noise didn't matter. All eyes were on the still figure of the black teenage girl who had not moved much in nearly an hour. Jada Cross remained standing, chin lifted, shoulders steady, ID badge clipped to her blazer now in full view. Her quiet presence had taken over the entire space, not with shouting or threats, but with something far more powerful, undeniable authority. The man in the black suit who had appeared minutes ago still stood near her, silent, composed, hands clasped. Another man joined shortly after, wearing an airport operations badge. He nodded at Jada without hesitation. Then came a woman in heels, clearly from corporate, holding a tablet close to her chest. She didn't speak to the crowd. She simply took one look at the ID on Jada's lapel and typed quickly on her screen. Behind them, the gate supervisor was no longer whispering into his radio. He was waiting. Waiting for instructions. Waiting for something he knew had passed far beyond his control. Tracy, the flight attendant who started it all, stood back near the jet bridge, pale and rigid. Her lips were pressed tightly together. She clutched her clipboard to her chest like a shield. No one was talking to her anymore, not even her co-workers. And still, Jada hadn't said much. She didn't need to, because at exactly 4:11 p.m., something remarkable happened. A tall, dark-skinned man in a tailored navy suit entered the terminal through the side security gate. He didn't pause to show a badge. He didn't need to. His walk was enough. Purposeful, calm, unshaken. It was Christopher Cross, Jada's father. But to the airline, to the airport, to the infrastructure behind it all, he was more than a parent. He was the quiet architect behind one of the largest logistics holding groups in North America. His company managed private airport terminals, invested in multiple airlines, and consulted for government transportation policy. His name didn't just hold weight, it reshaped industries. He reached Jada without a word. She didn't cry. She didn't run into his arms. She just nodded once, gently, as if they had already said everything they needed to say before this moment ever came. And then came the reveal. With one slow motion, Christopher removed a single business card from his pocket and handed it to the operations manager who had just arrived. It was white, smooth, and bore only a few words in elegant print. Christopher L. Cross, Chairman, Cross Global Holdings. Primary investor, Apex Airlines Group. The man holding the card didn't blink. He simply stepped backward and tapped into his headset. Jada's live stream had already exploded. Comments poured in like floodwaters. He's her dad. He owns the airline? Wait, he's the actual investor? This can't be real. But it was. The gate supervisor received a message on his device that made his knees buckle slightly. His eyes darted to Tracy. She already looked defeated, like she had sensed this was coming long before the truth arrived. The screens above the gate flickered again. This time, instead of boarding status updates, a message displayed in white text on a blue background. Flight 227 delayed. Executive review in progress. Please remain at gate. Passengers gasped. Some leaned forward. A few even clapped. No one had seen anything like this before. Not at an airport. Not like this. Christopher turned to his daughter and gave her a small nod. She knew what it meant. She stepped forward. Finally. Not toward the plane. Not toward the gate desk. But toward Tracy. The crowd held its breath. But Jada didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She didn't even frown. Instead, she pulled out her phone and opened a document she had prepared earlier. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't loud. It was simply a list, names, times, screenshots, passenger recordings, and a full outline of every step the airline had failed in. She handed it to the operations manager and simply said 4 words that would later trend online. Please process this report. He took the phone without hesitation. Across the airport, multiple departments received real-time alerts. Legal, HR, communications, compliance. The airline's entire crisis chain was now active, and at the center of it was a teenage girl in a navy blazer. The flight was officially grounded. Not for weather, not for maintenance, but for truth. Inside a nearby executive lounge, a private conference room had already been prepared. Glass walls, polished oak table, microphones, legal representatives, and a representative from the Aviation Regulatory Board. Jada and her father were invited in moments later, but not before one final look back at the crowd. Jada turned around slowly. She didn't look angry. She looked free. Free from needing to explain herself anymore. Free from having to prove that she belonged in a seat she had paid for. Free from the quiet weight that black girls are often forced to carry, even while doing everything right. And now, the people watching her didn't see a girl trying to get on a plane. They saw a girl who grounded one. People clapped. Not a loud, wild cheer. Just soft, steady clapping that grew from a few hands into something real. Something respectful. Tracy didn't say a word. Her hands trembled at her sides. Her supervisor stood beside her, saying nothing. They both watched Jada walk away, knowing this moment would stay with them forever. Jada disappeared behind the glass doors with her father and the team now handling the review. Outside, the crowd stayed near. The live stream continued. Screenshots flooded Twitter, TikTok, and news feeds. And the caption that captured it best came from the original live streamer who had been there since minute 1. They tried to embarrass her. Instead, she educated the world. The boardroom was quiet, but not peaceful. There was tension in the air, thick like fog before a storm. It wasn't just the room's cold lighting or the stillness of the corporate chairs lined up around the long table. It was what the silence meant. Something had gone very wrong. And now, the people in charge had no choice but to face it. Inside the glass-walled conference room on the upper level of the airport terminal, Jada sat beside her father, posture straight, face calm. She wasn't nervous. Not anymore. Not after everything. What she felt now wasn't fear. It was clarity. And maybe, for the first time all day, a little relief. Her phone was turned off. Her voice was quiet. But her presence filled the room more than any loud argument ever could. Across from her sat senior managers from the airline, legal officers, PR heads, and HR leads. None of them made excuses. They didn't try to interrupt. They barely met her eyes. The evidence had already spoken for itself. The live stream footage, the crowd reports, the screenshots, none of it could be erased. None of it could be ignored. What happened at Gate 34C wasn't just poor customer service. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a breakdown of trust, of policy, and of basic respect. And now the airline had to account for it. Christopher Cross didn't speak first. He didn't need to. Instead, the lead HR official stood up and read the findings. Both gate staff and flight attendants had violated the airline's non-discrimination policy. There had been no policy trigger for security intervention. Jada's documentation had scanned as valid at every step. She had never raised her voice. She had followed every instruction. And yet, she had been treated as suspicious based solely on her appearance. The staff members involved had already been removed from their shift and were under formal review. By the end of the day, those reviews would become terminations. But even that wasn't the whole story. Because this wasn't just about what happened to Jada. This was about every quiet complaint ignored. Every passenger who had walked away from similar moments with no live stream to back them up. No viral moment. No voice. Jada had become a mirror. A reflection of something deeper inside the system that could no longer be hidden. Downstairs in the terminal, the scene had not settled. Passengers were still gathered. Some were calling the airline's support lines. Others were tagging news agencies and civil rights groups. Airport security had even cordoned off part of the area to manage the flow of people and press. But the most powerful statement hadn't come from the media. It came from the passengers themselves. A printed sign now sat taped beside the gate, made by hand from a page torn out of someone's journal. It read, "Gate 34C, where she stood, where we finally saw." Back in the boardroom, Jada listened as the corporate team listed changes they were already planning. Mandatory bias training, new passenger support officers, clearer accountability lines. But Jada wasn't interested in promises alone. She wanted follow-through, action, structure. She quietly passed across a single sheet of paper, a written statement, signed by her, listing 5 policy recommendations. None were complicated. All were doable. They included real-time passenger escalation review, direct accountability logs tied to badge numbers, and a public apology campaign that highlighted the importance of human dignity, not just brand image. The room took notice, not just because of the content, but because of who had written it. A teenage girl who had spent her day being humiliated and still had the strength to help fix the very system that tried to silence her. The company's CEO joined by video call. He looked tired, ashamed. He didn't try to spin the event. He simply asked to hear Jada's voice directly. And finally, she spoke. Not for long. Not with anger, but with steady, careful words. She spoke about being 17 and having to carry the weight of other people's assumptions. She spoke about how it feels to walk through a world that questions you before you even speak. She spoke about what it meant to be calm, not because she wanted to, but because the world demanded she had to be, just to stay safe. And then she said something no one forgot. She said that the worst part wasn't the doubt. It wasn't being stopped. It wasn't even being surrounded by security. It was that almost no one around her said anything. The ones who saw and filmed stayed quiet. The ones who wondered stayed seated. And that silence, she said, can feel heavier than any insult. The room stayed silent afterward, not out of awkwardness, but out of respect, because Jada hadn't just revealed the airline's failure. She had reminded them all of their own. The meeting ended with signatures and commitments. Cross Global Holdings would lead a new passenger equity board. Jada would sit on it as a youth advisor. Gate 34C would be part of the airline's internal training videos. Not to embarrass, but to educate, to document what happens when systems fail, and how they can be rebuilt. Outside the boardroom, passengers watched the monitors light up with a new message. Flight 227 canceled. Review in process. People didn't groan. They didn't complain. They knew why, and most were glad it happened. Not because their plans were ruined, but because someone finally stopped everything to deal with something that mattered more than departure times. That night, Jada didn't fly, but her story soared anyway. Across news channels, blogs, and social media platforms. The footage reached millions. Civil rights groups shared her speech. Schools replayed the gate footage in diversity sessions. And parents pointed to her name as proof that their children could speak truth without shouting. Tracy, the flight attendant, packed her belongings in silence. Her badge was taken. Her career paused. Not just because of one action, but because of years of unchecked habits that had finally come into full view. Jada, on the other hand, went home not broken, but brighter. She had gone to the airport for a simple flight, but she left having grounded a system. Weeks passed, yet the memory of what happened at Gate 34C never faded. What started as a moment of quiet injustice had grown into something far bigger than anyone imagined. Jada Cross was no longer just a passenger. She had become a symbol, not by choice, not by plan, but by truth. Across airports nationwide, conversations were changing. Not because they were easy, but because they could no longer be avoided. The footage of Jada's calm resistance, the silence she held with strength, and the moment her badge changed everything had gone global. Her face appeared not on gossip blogs, but in think pieces, in news panels and education conferences. Not because she wanted fame, but because she represented a question the world could no longer ignore. What if dignity only came after proof of power? The airline, one of the country's most respected carriers, had taken a hard hit. Stocks dropped in the first week after the story broke. But something remarkable happened next. Instead of denying fault or hiding behind corporate statements, the board did something almost unheard of. They began to listen, and they invited Jada in. It began with an internal transformation project, codenamed Operation Gate 34, in her honor. But it didn't stop there. New hiring policies were written to ensure frontline staff came from diverse backgrounds, with lived experience, not just service checklists. Promotion pathways were changed. Training wasn't just about customer service anymore. It was about equity, awareness, and healing. Jada helped review the training modules herself. She was the youngest person ever to advise the airline's ethics council. At just 17, she spoke with CEOs, regulators, and union leaders. But she never changed her tone. She remained soft-spoken, patient. The girl who stood quietly at the gate, surrounded by doubt, was now the one shaping what would happen at every gate moving forward. And yet, even with all this, Jada never let it be just about her. In meetings, she brought stories of others who weren't filmed. People who had been judged, overlooked, removed from planes for reasons that had nothing to do with boarding passes. She read their letters aloud. She named their names. She made space for them. And that's what made her leadership different. She wasn't angry. She was focused. She didn't want revenge. She wanted repair. Across social media, people began tagging hashtag Gate34Reform. Teachers included her story in lesson plans. Parents spoke her name around dinner tables. Flight attendants, even those who didn't agree with her at first, began to admit something had needed to change for a long time. And Jada had become the quiet spark that finally lit the match. Months later, the airline held a public event. Not a press stunt. A real community gathering. It wasn't at a fancy hotel or executive boardroom. It was at the same airport, at the same gate. Gate 34C. The walls were now lined with photos of the Reform Committee. Behind protective glass was a printed poster from that day, the one someone had written in pen and taped to the counter. Gate 34C, where she stood, where we finally saw. That message now stood forever beneath a bronze plaque. In honor of Jada Cross, for showing us that quiet power can change everything. Staff gathered that day weren't forced. They came willingly. Many shook her hand. Some said thank you. Others simply stood beside her and let their silence be the apology their words had failed to give before. Christopher Cross stood nearby, not in the spotlight, but just close enough to see his daughter lead. He had taught her to be still in the storm, but now he watched her become the eye of it, calm, steady, and in control. Jada didn't speak long that day. She didn't need to. Her speech was simple. She said she hadn't meant to change the airline. She had just wanted to get on a plane. But when the world asked her to stay small, she chose instead to stand still. Not with anger, but with truth. After the event, reporters asked what was next. Would she pursue politics? Start a foundation? Write a book? She just smiled. "I'm going to college," she said softly. And then she walked away. Back online, the story continued to grow. Not because of drama, but because people could finally see a version of justice that didn't involve yelling or headlines designed to shock. This one felt different. This one felt earned. Jada's story became a case study. But more than that, it became a reminder that when someone stands alone but stands tall, it can move even the largest machines. And while flights returned to normal and life went on, one thing remained different. Gate 34C was no longer just a place in an airport. It was a lesson, turning point, a tribute, for every person who was told they didn't belong until they proved otherwise. And for every person who stayed quiet until they decided not to. If the story moved you, even just a little, hit that subscribe button to support stories that matter. And please share your thoughts in the comments. Because real change starts with listening and refusing to stay silent.